Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for attending. So yes, my name is Maite Uso de la Fuente, and I'm a lecturer in Spanish at the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Leicester. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about the Spanish Civil War, specifically about the Spanish Civil War in image and song. So before I start, I should give you a content warning, just to say that some of the images featured in the presentation are quite graphic, and some of you might find disturbing, obviously because of the content that we are discussing today. And this includes the title image, which is one of the more iconic images of the Spanish Civil War. It's known as Death of a Militiaman, or Muerte de un Miliciano, by Hungarian-born photographer Robert Capa, and is supposed to capture the moment when this militiaman is hit by a bullet and he's falling back. But it's an image that I also chose because it's been mired in controversy about whether or not it's a real image or whether it was faked and staged. So think about fake news as something quite new, but actually 90 odd years ago, in the context of the Spanish Civil War, we have examples of this. So our aims for today are to provide you with a very basic historical background on the Spanish Civil War, and also to introduce you to the rich cultural archive of the conflict, as we will see, mostly because it's a short session. We're just going to focus on images and a little bit of music. And we will also think about the legacies of the Spanish Civil War in the present, how they continue to resonate in the 21st century. So I've brought a couple of examples at the end to help us think about this. So very briefly, but very broadly, when, where, what, how, why? What is the Spanish Civil War? Well, the Spanish Civil War starts in July 1936, and it starts as a military coup that goes wrong, that doesn't succeed. So there's a group of generals that raise up in arms against the democratically elected government, but they can't seize power straight away. So the military coup fails because the Republican government refuses to hand over power to the military, but also because there is considerable popular support for that government. And the government actually arms civilians who take on arms to defend the government. So that failure of the coup d'etat sets in motion an almost 3-year conflict between Republicans, who are in favor of liberal democracy and a more egalitarian society, and nationalists on the other side. So defenders of tradition and authority who back the coup by the army and who believe Spain needs an authoritarian leader. What are the causes of the conflict? Well, very, very briefly, the root causes of the conflict are multiple. On the one hand, social and economic. Early 20th century Spain is a very unequal society in economic terms. We have a mostly agricultural economy with a mostly destitute, desperately poor rural population, and a handful of very wealthy landowners that, particularly in southern and central Spain, have often very large estates. In urban centers, Barcelona, Bilbao, where there's increasing industrialization, we see rising tensions between workers who are becoming politicized, joining trade unions and demanding better rights, and their employers. Politically, there are also tensions between regionalist tendencies, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, so historical regions that have their own identity, their own language, and who want autonomy, or in some cases even independence, and central Spain, where very often there is an impulse to govern centrally from Madrid, not really granting any autonomy to the regions. There's also a conflict between liberals or progressives on the one hand and traditionalists, as seen in that division between nationalists and Republicans. And finally, the efforts of the Republican government against which the nationalists rise have been also hampered by the power and influence of the Catholic Church and the army, which are very resistant to some of the reforms that Republican government has tried to implement. But while the Spanish Civil War is first and foremost a Spanish conflict, as the name suggests, it also has an international dimension that we need to remember, because this is a conflict that happens against a backdrop of growing tensions in Europe between, on the one hand, Germany and Italy, so fascist powers, the liberal democracies, on the other hand, of France and Britain, and then, of course, the communist USSR. And as we will see, Spain becomes a little bit of a stage where some of the conflicts of the World War II and some of the tactics are rehearsed. Before we move on to consider this, just looking at the two sides of the conflict, nationalists, right-wing rebels in quotation marks, in the sense that they rise up against the elected government, are led by General Franco, and they launch a military coup in July 1936. They are supported by the Catholic Church, by the armed forces, and by civilian militias linked to specifically what is known as Falange, which was the Spanish fascist party. And on the bottom right of the slide, you can see the symbol and slogan of Falange. The nationalists are also supported by wealthy landowners and industrialists who see some of the reforms that the Republican government wanted to implement as threatening their interests. They're also supported by sectors of the middle classes who had been alienated by the Republican government's anti-clericalism, or perceived anti-clericalism. That is, the idea that the Republican government was against the Catholic Church and against the Catholic faith. And finally, also Catholic organizations support the coup and the nationalists once this failed coup escalates and becomes a fully fledged war. Very early on and very decisively, the nationalists will receive military aid from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and this will be key in how the conflict unfolds. On the other hand, we have the Republicans who, as I was saying earlier, defend a liberal democracy and favor a more egalitarian society. Whilst in government, they had campaigned and worked towards a reform of land ownership in Spain, a type of agrarian reform that would break up the large estates and would therefore perhaps curb the power of the large landowners, and would also optimize agriculture in Spain. They also favored freedom of religion, and they wanted Spain to become a secular state, so a state with no specific religion, where no specific religion is privileged. They were also in favor of regional autonomy, so the idea of devolving power to Catalonia and the Basque Country particularly. And they also were pioneers of female franchise. So just as an example, women in Spain had the right to vote before they did so in France. They were slightly behind women in Britain, but they were not far behind. So in 1931, there is a law to pass female franchise. The Republicans, like the nationalists, are quite a broad coalition of groups. So on the one hand, we have more moderate Republicans who want a parliamentary democracy, but do not necessarily object to a market or capitalist economy. And on the other hand, we have socialists and communists who, to different degrees, want to abolish private property, all the way down to anarchists who question any form of the question that the state as a concept, and they are in favor of self-management. The Republicans, once the military coup happens, they appeal for help from France in the first instance. But as we will see, France does not deliver for reasons that we will be discussing shortly. So they are reliant on aid from the Soviet Union and Mexico. But the type of aid they receive, the conditions attached to this, and of course the fact that the Soviet Union and Mexico are geographically so much further away than Germany and Italy are, means that the level of support they get from abroad is far, far less. And this becomes quite a determinant factor in the development of and the outcome of the war. Again, I've included in the slides some elements of visual symbols linked to the Republic. On the bottom left, bottom right, you have the Republican flag, and on the other hand, you have the Republic represented as a young woman, a bit reminiscent of the figure of Marianne, and she has the scales of justice in one hand and a torch of light indicating progress in the other hand. Okay, so now I would like us to play a little game of nationalist or Republican propaganda poster bingo. One of the elements that is interesting and novel for the Spanish Civil War is that propaganda is used widely and very often through the deployment of posters, propaganda posters. Bear in mind that literacy rates in Spain in the 1930s were not brilliant, so posters were a very powerful means to convey information even among those who were illiterate, because you could rely on color and imagery to present a powerful message, even for those who maybe were not able to read. So you could either raise your hand or you could maybe put something in the chat, but I wanted to ask you whether you think the posters on this slide are nationalist or Republican, bearing in mind some of the imagery you've already seen as part of the presentation and some of the ideas mentioned. This is not really to put you on the spot, and it's fine if you get it wrong, all right, but I'd like to see if you can guess, if you want to take any guesses.
We've had
Sorry?
guesses for nationalist, 3 guesses for nationalist.
Oh, okay. So it seems that everyone who's guessing is guessing right. It'd be interesting to know what gave it away for those students. It might take you a while to type. Obviously, the middle one has the name Falange, which I mentioned was the Spanish fascist party that supported the nationalist. So that is a giveaway. And you can see the arrows and yoke, which are in the background of the poster on the right. And the other poster, we see a soldier brushing away Bolshevism, also the political class and Masons and all sorts of groups that, again, nationalists were not very sympathetic to. So this idea that equating them with some sort of dirt that needs to be brushed away, eradicated. Okay, what about this new slide? Nationalist or Republican? You will probably guess it right just by elimination, but it would be interesting if you included in your guesses anything that draws your attention. If you think of, for example, giving you a massive clue here about the slogans used in the posters and the language used for those slogans. Yes, we have several women, and that's a very good point. That on the Republican side, in the early stages of the war, particularly, less so later on, but you had women enlisting and volunteering alongside men, and we see the miliciana or militia woman in the poster there very vividly, where she's in the forefront with a finger pointing. What is the slogan accompanying that poster? What language is used there? Any guesses? It's not Spanish. You can hopefully tell maybe that much.
Had somebody say Catalan, somebody's said French ?
Yeah, it's Catalan. And again, the fact that they're using a regional language already sort of reinforces the idea that this is a Republican poster. You wouldn't have seen that in a nationalist poster where it was very much about protecting the unity of Spain, an idea of a homogeneous Spain with just Castilian Spanish as the language that is recognized. And then we have a poster that uses English. Of course, here, we can surmise that it's not about winning the hearts and minds of regular Spaniards and getting them to enlist for your side. Who are they trying to appeal to? Any guesses? Sorry, I know I'm making your work very hard.
Somebody said Western allies for support.
So it's obviously addressing Britain. Well, the text in English is intended to affect public opinion in Britain. And of course, the slogan is the military practice of rebels. We have a picture of a casualty of a child that we can imagine is casualty from aerial bombardment, which was carried out mostly by German and Italian planes, incidentally, that were supporting the nationalists. And then the slogan, if you tolerate this, your children will be next. What do they mean? And why are they saying it? Just testing your knowledge.
So we've got that Niamh said they're going to try take over Europe. We've also had Yuri say their children will be affected as a consequence of war. Monica said to use fear as a tactic so people are influenced by the propaganda.
Yes. So all of those correct in different ways. So Britain and France, when war breaks out in Spain, decide not to intervene. The Republican government first approaches France and says for help. And France at first seems willing to support the Republican government, but very quickly, after some conversations with Britain, they decide that they better stay out of this. And they do that because there is a fear that if they support the Republican government, this could become a European-wide conflict. Because as I said at the start, it's in a context of rising tensions between Germany and Italy on the one side and France and Britain on the other. And what the Republican government is trying to convey here to Britain is that not doing anything isn't going to stop escalation. It's just going to embolden potentially Italy and Germany. So trying to appeal to Britain and France to abandon non-intervention. Now, non-intervention was the stance of Britain and France of deciding we want to stay away out of this conflict. This is a Spanish problem. We want nothing to do with it. Let them sort it out themselves, which in theory seems a very reasonable stance to take, but non-intervention didn't really work in terms of keeping a level playing field, because of course Italy and Germany were intervening in favor of the nationalists. So it really disadvantaged the Republicans, and the Republicans spent a significant amount of energy and effort, as this poster shows, in trying to get Britain and France to change their mind and to start supporting the Republic. Okay, so of course, Britain and France, as we said, did not intervene, and they promoted a non-intervention agreement, which many countries signed, including countries that were involved in the conflict, but proceeded to flaunt the agreement they had just signed because there were no consequences to violating the non-intervention agreement after having signed it. But there were international combatants involved in the war through the International Brigade. This is a group of around 45,000 volunteers from over 50 different countries in Europe and beyond, who came to fight on the Republican side in Spain. And the reason why they decided to do this and to become involved in a conflict that seemingly had very little to do with them is because they saw this as a global fight. They saw this as the first stage in a broader fight against fascism in Europe. Some of them, for example, were coming from Germany and had to go into exile due to their religious identity or due to their political beliefs. So they had already had to leave their home country. The international brigades were recruited and trained and coordinated by an international communist organization known as the Comintern. And they played a crucial role in the defense of Madrid in 1936 and in offensives in Aragon in 1937. So really, in the autumn of 1936, only a few months into the war, Franco's troops come came very close to taking Madrid, and they would have probably won the war sooner. But the help of the international brigades, together with some decisions taken by the nationalists, prevented this from happening. Eventually, amid internal conflict, and given that by 1938 it seems apparent that the Republicans have lost the war, the international brigades leave Spain. I've brought you a picture from one of the brigades called the Lincoln Brigade, and asked a group of students recently what they thought, where they thought they were from based on the name. I should point out Lincoln doesn't reference the UK town of Lincoln, it references Abraham Lincoln. So taking that into account, any guesses as to where these volunteers were from?
Emma has said the USA, as has
Yes,
Kay.
yeah, they're American volunteers, and usually international brigades were grouped into different brigades, and often the name reflected the country of origin. So there were Italians under a Garibaldi brigade, for example. So this is the Lincoln Brigade. Anything else that you notice in this image that might be, I don't know, draw your attention? And it might be hard for you to spot from the vantage point of 2024, but think that this is almost 100 years ago. I take it there are no comments forthcoming?
We've had 2 comments. So we've
Oh.
had black men and rarely anyone of an ethnic background.
Okay, so 2 slightly contrasting, but the first one about black men being in this unit is the one I was hoping for. This is the first time that Americans fought in a non-segregated military unit in the Spanish Civil War. Even in the Second World War, US military was still often segregated against along racial lines. So this was quite radical for its time, having black men fight alongside white men, something that hadn't happened before, and that obviously spoke of this egalitarian ethos of the Lincoln Brigade, but more widely Republican Spain. And again, drawing on the photographic archive of the Spanish Civil War, I should start by saying that we have a very rich number of photographs, some of which are still being discovered. There was a whole suitcase that was discovered randomly in Mexico about 20 years ago with negatives that had been taken there by someone who went into exile, and new photographs emerged 60 years after the conflict. So some photographs are occasionally still emerging. The Spanish Civil War was the first armed conflict that was properly covered by an international press, whereby photographers could really get close to the action. And this hadn't happened before because the technology was not there. So obviously we have photographs from other wars going as far back as the Crimean War, but they were generally images that were taken after battles, and they were normally staged and posed. Here we actually have reporters in the front lines taking images as things happen. That's not to say that all the images are candid ones. Of course, the image we can see there of the lady with the tiny handgun is clearly posed for, and it's very stylized. And I really enjoy it because we see a woman obviously receiving training on the beach, but it's the contrast, I think. There's obviously the very stylized silhouettes that we see against the sky. Also the very slightly ridiculous tiny handgun that it's not going to be very much use at all in a context of war. But even the fact that she's wearing a heeled shoe as well gives us all these contrasts in the image, as well as the sort of dark and light contrast. And then we have 2 other images which show us something else that we've touched upon, which is obviously the very prominent role of women who were enlisting alongside men in the war and fighting alongside men. So they were not joining the militias in an ancillary capacity. They were not there for support as nurses and cooks and messengers. They were actually fighting alongside the men and receiving training in how to handle a weapon and using weapons alongside the men. And as you can see as well, very often, very young people who would be not much older than yourselves, as you can see in some of the images there, particularly the group photo taken from Barcelona. Okay, so how does the war progress and how does it end? The war ends on the 1st of April 1939 with a victory by the nationalists led by General Francisco Franco. It leaves behind a trail of destruction, hundreds of thousands dead, with atrocities committed on both sides, as often happens in a context of war. Tens of thousands of Republicans are killed in the immediate aftermath of the war by Franco's forces, who were intent on not just winning the war, but really annihilating its enemy to ensure a long-lasting peace and a long-lasting victory. We see 1 million detained as political prisoners and often used as cheap labor in order to reconstruct the country and to embark on fairly ambitious infrastructure projects. And again, a large number, 400,000 estimated Republicans who go into exile. Many cross on foot onto France, and then from there make their way sometimes to Britain or to Latin American countries, where, of course, people often had the advantage of speaking the same language. And as a result of the war, we have a national Catholic dictatorship ruling Spain and in place between 1939 and 1975, when General Franco finally dies, and his death sets in motion a process of transition to democracy. So that's how the war ends. But before dwelling or thinking about that ending, I'd like us to think about the very many and very varied cultural responses to the war from around the world. So we've looked at some posters today and some photographs. We'll look at a couple of other examples in a minute. But just to give you other instances, we have the work of George Orwell, who wrote Homage to Catalonia, and he writes and published that text before the end of the war. That's based on his own experiences fighting in Spain. Ernest Hemingway wrote For Whom the Bells Toll, which is fiction, whereas Orwell is more of a memoir. Ernest Hemingway's novel is fiction, but Hemingway was in Spain during the war covering the conflict. We have the work of Pablo Neruda, who lived in Spain before the war and wrote several poems about his feelings and his mourning, in a way, for the demise of the Spanish Republic. Octavio Paz from Mexico wrote, again, essays and other works. André Malraux in France, again, he fought in the war and then he also wrote about this experience. And of course, a range of Spanish authors, poets like Alberti and Machado, novelists like Ramón J. Sender or Camilo José Cela, and also the poet Miguel Hernández. We might also think about visual artists, painters like Picasso, Joan Miró, Salvador Dalí, or photographers. Some of the pictures I included, some of the photographs are, the title image is by Robert Capa. Gerda Taro is the author of some of the other pictures featured in another slide, and also the work of Catalan photographer Agustí Centelles, for example. And one of the most iconic images to come out of the conflict is this painting, Picasso's Guernica from 1937. And what I'd like to now ask you all is, do you know what the painting references? What is Guernica, in other words?
So we've had the bombing of Guernica, a village in the Basque Country that was bombed by Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so that's entirely correct. This is the bombing of Guernica in April 1937. And that event was shocking, and it convulsed public opinion in Spain and beyond, because it was a deliberate targeting of a civilian population. So there were no military installations in Guernica. There was no industry that could affect the war effort. There was no, the main reason why it is likely to have been targeted is because it had a certain symbolic value, culturally speaking. It was seen as sort of the cradle of a Basque regional identity. But it didn't have any, it didn't follow any strategic objectives. And it was really believed to be, although this is disputed still by historians, and I'm not a historian, I'm not a military historian, but it was at the time thought to be the first deliberate, intentional targeting of a civilian population through aerial bombing. And of course, this might seem like nothing new to us, but at the time, the conception of war and the etiquette of war was that war was something that happened on the front lines and in trenches, and civilians might occasionally get caught in a crossfire, but they weren't a target. In this instance, they became the target, and they became the target in order to force the surrender of the Basque region, which was important because industrially was together with Catalonia, where most of Spain's industry was based at this time, not in Guernica itself, but in the Basque Country as a region. And the bombing of Guernica did succeed in forcing or accelerating the surrender of the regional Basque government, which happened about 6 weeks after the bombing of Guernica. But it also generated such an outcry that the nationalists pretended they hadn't done this. Well, it wasn't the nationalists directly, but as someone wrote in the chat, they enlisted the support of Germany's Condor Legion, their fleet of planes that have the capacity and the technology to do this. The outcry in the international press was so pronounced that actually the nationalists pretended this had been the Republicans doing this in order to sort of then pin it on them as a sort of propaganda. We partly know that that is not true, thanks to a British correspondent from the Times, George Steer, who got to Guernica within hours of the event and was able to see what happened, to photograph it and to document it. So thanks to George Steer and his work as a journalist, the nationalist sort of denials were sort of not widely believed. And interestingly as well, it was the bombing of Guernica didn't sway public opinion in Britain enough for Britain and France to abandon non-intervention, but it did sway public opinion enough to then lead to at the time, biggest refugee intake by Britain in its history, whereby they agreed to take over 4,000 Basque children and house them to protect them from further attacks of this type. So that is, Picasso's response to the bombing of Guernica, where we see a depiction of a woman and a baby and other human figures who are injured or dying, the animals being slaughtered, trying to symbolically capture the horror of that episode in the war. So why are we still interested in this conflict? Why should we be? I'd like to sort of gradually come to an end by arguing that part of what makes the Spanish Civil War so compelling and still interesting almost 90 years on is that in many ways it was a war of firsts, a war where certain things happened for the first time in history. We have that deliberate targeting of a civilian population that I've just discussed in Guernica, but also think about the role of women joining men on the front lines. Think of the role of women also as war photographers. We have correspondents like Gerda Taro, who actually died on assignment in Spain whilst covering the war, or Kati Horna, another international correspondent who was a woman, and also in the rear guard, again, filling in the jobs that some men had left to take up arms. The international brigades, as this group of volunteers who join, thinking that they're fighting for, a valid cause and in a global fight, and willing to put their lives on the line in a conflict that's not really in their homeland and that seems to potentially not affect them directly, or really not affect them directly. And very often, in relation to the international brigades, the Spanish Civil War, in a similar way as with World War II, has been seen as the last great cause, as one of the few wars where perhaps there is a moral justification for war because it's defending something just and legitimate against something that is authoritarian and violent and unfair. And finally, for many historians, Spanish Civil War served as a sort of dress rehearsal for the Second World War, in as much as it allowed Italy and Germany to see how much they could press Britain and France before facing any consequences. And it became apparent to them that they could go quite far. They could be quite blatantly and openly involved in the war without facing any sanctions and any consequences. And of course, Germany tried much of the technology that it would later deploy in the Second World War on Spanish soil first. The other reason why I think this remains a compelling conflict is because, as I've tried to show to you today, it elicited all these very interesting artistic responses. So we have unprecedented press coverage of the conflict. We also have, as a result, a very rich photographic archive, widespread use of propaganda posters. And I've just shown you a handful of selected examples, but there are dozens and dozens of them. And also just poetry, novels, paintings, music, both by established authors in Spain and abroad, but also, and interestingly, at a grassroots level. And I'm going to give you a brief example of the song repertoire of the Spanish Civil War, particularly on the Republican side. So one of the interesting developments that happened during the war is that very often existing melodies would be taken and new lyrics would be linked to them to create a song that would resonate with the war effort on the Republican side. So I've brought a little example. Bear with me because I'll have to tweak with screens and technology, but hopefully you can share it. You can hear this.
Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero. Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero. En el frente de Aragón, primera línea de fuego. En el frente de Aragón, primera línea de fuego. Y aunque nos tiren el puente y también la pasarela, y aunque nos tiren el puente y también la pasarela, nos verás cruzar el Ebro y en un barquito de vela. Nos verás cruzar el Ebro y en un barquito de vela. 10.000 veces que lo tiren, 10.000 veces que lo haremos. 10.000 veces que lo tiren, 10.000 veces que lo haremos. Aquí estamos compañeras y aquí estamos compañeros. Y aquí estamos compañeras y aquí estamos compañeros. Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero. Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero. En el frente de Aragón, primera línea de fuego. En el frente de Aragón, primera línea de fuego.
Okay, so just an example there, which I chose. This is, I've brought you the lyrics there in English, in Spanish and in English. And obviously there would be variations to these lyrics. So the same melody has a range of different lyrics because people would, different groups and different people would adapt them to depending on where they were based in the front and so on. I brought it as an example of, as I say, the further cultural creativity that was partly responding to the situation of conflict or inspired by it. And also I think because it illustrates the sense, this is a song that Republicans sung, it illustrates, if you look at the lyrics, that sense that they are really, that the other side, the nationalists, have the military advantage. They have the firepower. There's the reference of them blowing up the bridge. And that idea that they know that the other side has the military advantage, but to that they are going to bring their perseverance as the way in which they can counter their inferiority in military terms. Hence the line, 10,000 veces que lo tiren, 10,000 veces que lo haremos. So that idea that they will persevere, no matter how many times they have to rebuild this, they will do this. In a different Spanish Civil War song, they have a similar line that echoes that sentiment again. De nada sirven bombas donde sobra corazón. So the idea that the other side might have the bombs, but we have, the spirit and the heart, and it won't be overcome. Obviously, it was eventually overcome. So it didn't prove accurate as a prediction, but nevertheless, that sort of ethos and that attitude. And just finally, to bring us to a close, wanted to give you some examples of how the Spanish Civil War still has that power to fascinate and inspire in the present. So I brought you some examples of COVID posters created by a Spanish artist who took his inspiration in terms of the visual language used on the Spanish Civil War posters I showed you earlier, to the point where even some of the emblems that you can see in the corner are copied from some of the ones in original Spanish Civil War posters. So perhaps trying to establish also a dialogue or an analogy between the exceptionality of the Civil War and the exceptionality of COVID, and the idea that the pandemic had to be something that people in Spain sort of fought collectively, and where, there was a sense of community and collective interest that was placed ahead of individual interests and desires. And earlier in this year in Paris, I don't know how closely you've been following the news, but interestingly, we had the Front Populaire, one of the groups or blocs that was running in the parliamentary elections in France. We saw their supporters recycle one of the slogans from the Spanish Civil War, the slogan "No pasarán." Do you know what "No pasarán" alludes to, or where it comes from? Does anyone want to hazard a guess in the chat? We saw an example of "No pasarán" being featured as text in one of the Republican posters that I showed you before, if you recall, a few slides back.
So we've had, does it mean they should not pass or they will not pass?
Mm-hmm. It literally means they shall not pass. And it's obviously mentioning the fact that those backing the military coup, once the coup fails, decide to obviously try to take Spain bit by bit militarily. So they're basically doing this sort of military incursion. And the Republicans and those who support the Republican government are trying to stop that progression. Hence the "they shall not pass" as a rallying cry. And it was something also that it was popularized at the start of the war. On the very sort of evening where the military coup fails, we had a woman called Dolores Ibarruri, known as La Pasionaria, or the impassioned one, because she was a very gifted orator. She went on Spanish state radio and broadcast, again, a very passionate speech saying "they shall not pass." Obviously, that's not the whole speech, but it was a fairly brief speech. But at the core of it, and she repeated it multiple times, is "they shall not pass." And this was, as I say, recycled by some supporters of French left-wing coalition known as the Front Populaire, in reference to the Rassemblement National, the far-right party in France. So this idea that they would unite to ensure that the far-right did not win in this year's French parliamentary election. So as you can see, the Spanish Civil War is still inspiring individuals and artists up to the present day. And I think I've done enough talking for now, and I think without further ado, I'm going to open up the floor for questions.
Fantastic. So we did have a question in the chat earlier on, and it was from Monica. So the question was it common for women to be joining in the army alongside the men, as she thought it was more in rare instances, or if they were needed heavily last minute?
So it changed throughout the course of the war. It was fairly, I mean, I think it's easy to overstate because they had this, people were very interested. So there's a lot of photographs of them, and they were an inspiration in general. So I think they were never a very high number. That's important to say as a disclaimer. But they were more numerous at the start of the war, because at the start of the war, the Republican side wasn't really a regular army. It was made up of these militias linked to trade unions or political parties or different groupings. So if you were a Chica del Cable, if any of you follow that series, that I know it's popular on Netflix, or a seamstress, and you belonged to a trade union, you might have been able to join through your trade union, and they would have provided weapons and training. So it was relatively accessible. That changed because as the war progressed, the Republican side became more like a regular army, and women became discouraged from being on the front lines. They weren't not allowed to be, but I think whereas at the start of the war, there was this general enthusiasm, sounds like the wrong word to use maybe for war, but the sense of everyone is welcome and a number of young women joining. As the war progressed, there was less, it was less so. And can anyone think of why there was maybe a move to discourage women from being on the front lines? Whenever I tell my students at university, they're always slightly surprised and shocked, but it's a very practical reason. If no one wants to hazard a guess.
Got nothing in the chat so far.
Yeah, it was. Yep.
Sorry, we've just had an answer in the chat. It's because they needed people to be domesticated and potentially give birth to increase the population.
Not quite, because I don't think they were looking that far ahead. Obviously, it was useful for women to stay in the rear guard to cover some of the jobs that men did, but I think there were enough men who were too old or too frail and non-combatant, and again, women who weren't combating. The main concern wasn't so much procreation as the spread of venereal disease. So, because obviously we're talking about the 1930s, no penicillin, no antibiotics, so there was a concern, and we know this because there were propaganda posters warning about the spread of venereal disease and to try and prevent this. So that was one of the key reasons why women eventually were discouraged from joining the fight in the front lines.
Fantastic. So we've had another question. So technically two questions I'm going to combine into one. So we've had, if you have any recommendations for any Spanish poets, and another one has asked for any recommendations for Spanish literature to prepare for university.
Yes. So for poems, I would say Miguel Hernández, because Miguel Hernández's poetry, especially the poetry he writes about the war and during the time of the war, is quite accessible. So he had, as a young man before the war, written a bit slightly more obscure, surrealist influenced poetry, which is very interesting if you enjoy poetry and surrealism, but perhaps a bit more obscure and difficult. But once the war starts, there is this progression in his work where he really wants to make poetry that's accessible to all, and that's going to encourage people to join the fight on the Republican side as he did, and that's going to also motivate those who are already in the trenches. So he also writes, for example, he has a beautiful poem that he writes called Canción del Esposo Soldado, and it's about being in the trenches and missing his wife and being homesick. So trying to write the kind of poetry that's accessible and that others could identify with, but that would also keep them going, in a sense. So that's for poetry. And more broadly for literature, well, where to start? There is quite a lot. One text that used to be quite often used for A-level syllabus is a text called Requiem por un campesino español. And that's quite a short novel. Some people call it a novella. You can read it in a couple of sittings. And it's quite nice in that it's a deceptively simple tale. It seems like a fable about Spain in the run-up to the war. It doesn't tell you much about the war itself, but just about the start of the war. But it recreates life in a village in early 20th century Spain, and how things seem to be changing in one way, and then suddenly violence starts occurring at the outskirts of the war. So it's a very interesting text, and it's a text written by someone who had first-hand lived experience of the war, Ramon J. Sender, and he was involved in the defense of Madrid, and had obviously quite a difficult time through the war because both his brother and his wife were executed during the war. So he survived the war and went into exile in the United States, which is where he wrote Requiem por un campesino español. And interestingly, Requiem was published in Mexico in the 1950s when it was first written, and it could only really be published in Spain in the 70s, around the time of Franco's death, because of course of censorship in Spain up until that point. So those would be two recommendations. In this slide, I've also got, and hopefully this will be shared with you, I've given you links to other resources if you wanted to learn more, where you can find other talks, and several materials that you might find interesting. So those are other resources. They're not literature as such. They're more resources about the history of the war, but they're there if you wanted to sort of dip into them in your own time. And in terms of further reading to prepare you for university, I think anything you can read that is literary prose will help. Anything you can read in general, but I think obviously trying to read something that is maybe trying to do interesting things with language will expand your vocabulary and will also get you to think of language and appreciate language in a different way. So yeah, I would just encourage everyone to do as much reading as possible, because I think also the way in which you acquire language is different. So of course, hearing and watching Netflix series and so on is really useful for your listening comprehension, and you should by all means do that. But I think sometimes when you read, you retain the vocabulary that you learn a little bit better, the capacity for recall, because you've seen it written down. Sorry, I'm just going on for ages, and there might be more questions.
Not had any more. Thank you, Maria, for putting the spelling for the novel in the chat as well.
Oh, yes.
So that's been helpful. But I can't see any more questions. If you do have any questions later on and you would like them to pass them on, then you can always email progression@le.ac.uk and we can pass these on as well. Maria has thankfully just added a link to Amazon as well with the book, so thank you for that as well. If you can see on the screen, we have the Heat link, which will lead you to a survey just asking about today's event. I have also popped this in the chat, and this will be sent to you in a follow-up email as well. But other than that, thank you so much for taking part in today's session, and I hope you guys enjoyed the session. Thank you so much, Maite, as well, for the session. It was absolutely great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it.